All right, let us officially begin. Yeah, let's begin. Hello, Beth. Get your syntax right. Um, my name is Beth Bando, and I'm the education director. And we have a bunch of people here that are on the executive committee, and they'll introduce themselves to you as the meeting goes on. We will begin with a land acknowledgement and the community ground rules that Brian will share with us. Brian is one of our co-chairs. Brian.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everyone. We at the Climate Reality Dallas-Fort Worth chapter acknowledge the ongoing harm caused by colonialism and white supremacy perpetrated in Texas. Indigenous communities have suffered genocides and forced removals from their lands. We recognize that we are standing on lands stolen from Indigenous people, particularly those of Kickapoo, Wichita, Tawakoni, Hamanos, and Comanche in the DFW areas. We are committed to cultivating mindfulness around the history of Native lands and communities through continuous education, participation, and active listening, which is very appropriate on this week, which we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday. And our ground rules for our meetings, we want to make space or take space, about 2 minutes each time for each attendant. Speak from the I perspective instead of generalizing. Practice active listening and seek to understand first. Assume good intentions, respect one another's space, time, and interest. Be willing to be uncomfortable, be open to productive discomfort. Let's have good discussions. Intent does not negate impact, and disagree without discord. Personal attacks and labeling have no space in our chapter, and accept that there is no quick fix. We're all working on this together. That's why we're here tonight. So let's undergo our meeting and let's try to find some solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And for our opening contemplation, we'll put our focus on the season. It is fall. A teacher of mine said, go with the flow. That is the medicine. That is the message of the season. When it is time for the tree to let go of the leaves, does the tree resist? So why should you? Our topic tonight is combating climate disinformation. And we have with us the co-chairs of the Chicago chapter, Tom Coleman and Bruce Mainzer. And rather than me reading your introduction, would both of you give us a little introductions about yourself and then go into your presentation, please?
Yeah, so what we'll do is I'll start off and I'll introduce Tom because he'll do the first section, and then Tom will introduce me for the second section. So, Tom, if you can put the screen up of the first slide, the title slide.
Everybody see this?
Yes.
I have a little. Hold on a second. I have a little problem with my screen right now for some reason.
We pause for tech.
Okay, I'm fine now. All right, so I see the screen. Thank you for attending today's meeting on combating climate disinformation. And thank you to the Dallas-Fort Worth chapter for this opportunity to present. You sound like a great chapter. I really appreciated that beginning. I'm Bruce Mainzer, co-chair of the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project, and I will be presenting alongside my other co-chair of the Chicago chapter, Tom Coleman. Our goal today is to equip you with the skills to identify disinformation and respond with factual information. Climate disinformation involves the deliberate spread of false information about climate change and climate action. It ranges from outright denial and conspiracy theories to subtler forms that create doubt about the urgency and feasibility of solutions like electric vehicles. This is especially critical in the US as political reluctance during election years often creates a void filled by fossil fuel interests spreading disinformation through social and mainstream media. Next slide, please. On our agenda today, Tom and I will present the first two sections on what we are seeing in terms of climate disinformation now, how we have little time to act to prevent the worst consequences of the climate emergency, as was just proven in Florida through two brutal hurricanes, and what we can do to promote actions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. After the presentations, we will open up for questions to hear ideas from you for actionable steps for the coming year to counter disinformation and advance climate action. So now to start, Tom Coleman will present the first section. Tom has extensive experience in manufacturing and information technology, retiring in 2018 as a chief information officer for his company. Go ahead, Tom.
All right, thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. All right, so let's get into disinformation and the facts. So when we look at the fossil fuel industry, obviously they have a bias. They want to continue to sell their products. And so I thought this was a good point made by the tobacco industry, which is really kind of almost a template for the fossil fuel industry. Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of facts that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also a means of establishing controversy. With controversy, people have doubt and they wonder if it's really true. This is nothing new. And I'm just listening. I won't go through every one of these, but I'm listing over time the different comments made by the American petroleum industry, Exxon, and so forth. For example, 1954, the worst thing that can happen is the passages of laws for the control of pollution. But then they had almost like a time of honesty in 1978. Present thinking holds, and this came from their scientists, that man has a window of 5 to 10 years before hard decisions might become critical. I mean, extremely truthful, obviously. In 1982, they continued with that by saying potentially catastrophic events if fossil fuel use is not reduced. Doubling of atmospheric CO2 would result in an average global temperature rise of 3°C. These results are in accord with scientific consensus. Extremely accurate, and that's exactly where we're heading, by the way. In 1989, though, they started to say, oh my gosh, the role of greenhouse gases is not well understood. There's a lot of, we really don't know about this. Victory will be achieved when average citizens has uncertainty about this, which continues today. And in fact, as late as 2017, CO2 is not a pollutant. More CO2 leads to faster, robust plant growth, including stable food crops. Moderate warming would have a positive effect on humanity. And then I'll mention the 8-figure disinformation program that the American Petroleum Institute launched. And I'll also mention a little bit more on the latest from the CEO of Exxon about his recent Fortune podcast. So here it is. Here's Darren Woods, ExxonMobil CEO, on the dirty secret of net zero. People who are generating emissions need to be aware, and they need to pay the price. The dirty secret nobody talks about is how much is all this is going to cost? Who's willing to pay for it? Darren Woods said on Fortune's Leadership Next podcast. Of course, it's interesting because many of you may or may not know that most of the pollution, most of the emissions actually don't come from the fossil fuel companies directly. It comes from us when we burn their products in our cars, gasoline cars, and natural gas, furnaces, and so forth and so on. So it's about a 10 to 15% from them. So they have a vested interest in saying, hey, we can start to cut some of our own emissions, but you guys, it's you. So we have to really ask the question, who is paying for climate and pollution damage? Well, our insurance companies are paying. We're paying. Look at Helene. And look at all the we've had something like 3 or 4 major hurricanes in this year alone. Who's paying for climate adaptation? Who's paying for those New Orleans sea barriers, ocean barriers to keep the city of New Orleans from going underwater? Who's paying for that? Who's paying for mitigation? We're paying, those of us that want to move ahead, want to start doing something about the problem, we're paying for it. But they're not paying for the damages. They're not paying for adaptation. They're not paying for mitigation. They're not help us moving forward. So given that situation, they're just putting it all on us. It's not their fault, it's our fault. So who should be paying becomes the real question here. So fossil fuel companies are privatizing profits and socializing costs. Everything they can do about making money at their end is what matters, and all the costs of their damaging products is on us, not on them. What a deal they have, right? Now, it doesn't even stop there, though. Let's talk about subsidies for a second here. Here are direct subsidies in trillions. If the numbers look small, remember, on the left, it's trillions of dollars that we're talking about here. So 2022, you can see almost double that of 2021 in terms of direct subsidies. That's money that comes from the government. And this is globally, by the way, money from the governments around the world that's handed over to fossil fuel industries. And then there's indirect subsidies, which are the much larger. This would be things like tax credits and other benefits they get. So for example, in the fossil fuel industry, not only can they claim any development that they have, and just like a solar farm can claim development in terms of their taxes, fossil fuel companies can do it too. They have a very special deal. A portion of every drop of oil they sell, they also get a tax credit for, which nobody else can qualify for. So when we look at that, we also know that it's gigantic in the United States as well. But here's a breakdown. This is direct subsidies, and you can see, coal, diesel. Look at natural gas. Now let's look at the indirect. Coal, diesel fuel, natural gas, which of course is about 85% methane, by the way, which is 80 times more powerful than CO2. 80 times over its first 20 years of release. And I think it drops down to something like 20 times or 23 times by, year 60 or 80 or something like that. So it's a major issue. So what would happen if all fossil fuel subsidies were removed? Well, it's estimated that 1.6 million lives would be saved around the world. And this would be a combination of the damaging effects of fossil fuels and the pollution effects, which something like 6 to 8 million people die every single year of pollution. That's toxic pollution versus greenhouse gas, climate wrecking pollution, okay? Government revenues would increase by 4.4 trillion, 3.6% of GDP. Emissions would fall 34% below 2019 levels. Hey, that's a good step forward. And incomes would be redistributed because subsidies benefit the rich more than the poor. Now let's look at the real cost. Let's take Darren, the CEO of Exxon, let's blow him away. If you look at this chart right here by the World Economic Forum, the zero line in this chart, I hope you can see my cursor moving across the screen. The zero line is if we don't do anything. Underneath that, you see a thin, a green line. Well, the green line would be mitigation costs for one of the IPCC's projections called RCP 2.6. They have different numbers associated with depending on how bad or good the projection is, but a fairly conservative one, which would be RCP 2.6. This is mitigation. Mitigation would be the cost to eliminate the root cause of climate problems. That's, of course, the most important thing we can do, right? Solve the problem so we have less damages and we have less adaptation needs. But our failure to mitigate causes the other things to increase ginormously. You can see here the cost of climate damages for the damages for RCP 2.6. You can see the purple line here. You can see how over time to 2100, how expensive it's going to be. And according to Darren Woods, hey, that's our fault. It's our responsibility, not them. And then if we look at climate damages RCP 8.5, that's the orange type of line that you see right here, which is absolutely devastating. Now, I don't know what the probability is for 2.6 versus 8.5. All I know is we are not achieving the Paris Climate Agreement, which was established in 2015, 9 years ago. We're not hitting the numbers on a global basis. Emissions are going up every year. Now, in the US, it's going down some, which is good news, not close to what Biden and the administration would like to have happen, but it is improving in the United States. It's absolutely not on a global basis, though. So you can see the colored bands would be the variance, divergence of climate damages, their estimate of what it would be. So it could be, even much worse or a little bit better. So in the face of this, and they've got to be confronted by this. This has got to be part of advocacy, right? In January of this year, the American petroleum industry launched an 8-figure media campaign designed to convince the public that a transition away from fossil fuels will jeopardize our way of life. It's against. We need to drill, baby, drill. We need to invest, or else we'll all freeze to death in the winter and die without air conditioning in the summer. Of course, we can see through the holes in that. It's about national security, it's about energy access, and it's about American infrastructure. And they have a very fancy, powerful marketing program to do just that. Now, this is one of the most successful and deceptive PR campaigns maybe ever developed. The strategy is to put as much blame on consumers, that's us, as possible, knowing that the consumer is not in a good place. If you're locked in, if you have 2 gasoline cars in your family, if you have a natural gas heater or an oil burner, if your stove is a gas stove, you might feel that, well, there's really not a lot you can do, right? We're not in a good place to do something about it. It basically ensures that nothing changes, especially if they inject an element of doubt. Unfortunately, they're wrong. Consumers can change. People like Bruce and myself drive electric vehicles. We've taken actions and we encourage, and Bruce will get into that later, on things that you can do to prove them wrong. Now, we've got to get the word out everywhere. A lot of people don't know what the IRA can do for them. They don't understand advocacy. They don't know what they're supposed to do. So that's part of our advocacy and what we need to do. So as we look at the latest climate disinformation, EV growth, for example, EV growth stalls amid consumer concerns. There's not enough chargers out there. The batteries go dead in, 5 years. All kinds of stuff that you hear about this stuff. But, unfortunately, it's really not true. You can see between 21, 22, and 23 what has happened to the electric vehicle fleet. And what we have to inject into people is our action plan is to inject facts into presentations and advocacy before they even ask the question about whether the batteries will die in the car and those kinds of things. So it needs to be proactively inserted into conversations. Now, it is true that in 2024, the increase in electric cars has slowed somewhat. It's going to be about 50 million cars instead of 40 million. So that 10 million is a reduction in the growth that we've seen up till now, but it is still growing. And as you can see on the right, Ford has gone into a redesign, finally developing electric vehicles that are going to be more cost effective. A $25,000 EV for 2026. They're canceling the big, expensive 3-row SUV that they were going to put on the road. And GM finally has put a $35,000 Chevy Equinox EV onto the road. An excellent car, by the way. Now, sure, you can pay more money for higher end models, 40, 45,000, but when you look at the average cost of a car today, it's very competitive. Now, they did take this Chevy Bolt off the road, unfortunately. That was a big mistake. However, they're going to reintroduce it next year. Hopefully they do it. And oh, by the way, Hyundai and Kia have new plants in Georgia. So instead of the cars coming in from South Korea, they're going to be made right here in the United States, means that they'll be able to get a tax credit from the IRA that they couldn't get before. Now let's look at this. Let's look at some facts. Some people say, well, CO2, it's no big deal, right? So the Keeling curve is on the left-hand side, showing over time what's happened to carbon dioxide as observed in Hawaii. Now we're sitting, I think May, we hit 425 parts per million, but it averages around 422, which is historically high. It's been like thousands of years since we've had anything close to this. And on the right side, what's more important is this CO2 cumulative emissions. You can see the United States, staggering amounts of emissions. We have put more bad stuff, bad greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere than any other country, including China. So when somebody tells you, oh, well, China's worse than we are, yeah, they're emitting today more than we are. They have got more EVs they're putting on the road, more solar panels that they're creating, and eventually, if we don't wise up, they're going to outdo us in the market across the world. And why is this important? Because it's cumulative. Carbon dioxide, CO2, right now is about 80% of the emissions. It has a GWP, a global warming potential of a 1. In 100 years, it's a 1. In 500 years, it's a 1. In 1,000 years, it's a 1. So when I say that 80% of the stuff that's in the atmosphere right now is a problem, it's going to be a problem for 500 years from now. And every year we're putting about 52 gigatons, 52 billion tons into the atmosphere. This is a staggering problem that's adding up over time to be very serious. And then there's, of course, methane, which is only 11%. But as I think I previously mentioned, it's about 83 times more powerful in the first 20 years. So in the short term, methane is a devastating thing. So natural gas, is that a good thing? Supposedly it's cleaner to burn that than coal. However, if you look at leakage and pipelines and everything, it's not. And if you look at your gas stove in your kitchen, the pollution that goes into your kitchen is pretty significant with your gas stove. We got to start calling methane gas, not natural gas. And then there's nitrous oxide, which is very serious and very, very powerful. So here's the carbon budget. I laugh all the time when we talk to politicians. They want to negotiate the emissions reduction in Illinois. Yeah, we're a blue state, but politicians are politicians, right? They want to say, hey, well, we should do this, but look, can we do this? Can we get away with this? Well, the answer is no. We have a budget. And here it is, 280 parts per million in 1850, and coal and oil and gas and cement and land use, that put up to about 600 parts per million. And then cement carbonization, land use, and ocean. So that would be, sinks, ocean sinks and so forth, which, by the way, are not sinking, are not absorbing as much as they used to. Brings us down to about 425 to 427 parts per million right now. So you can see that this is a building catastrophic emissions disaster if we don't deal with it very, very quickly. So what is it that we really have to do? Well, we have to help people to understand that if we look at these historical emissions, so this is the black line here, and we say, well, what did the Climate Agreement say? Well, it said we had to cut emissions of CO2 43%, or about 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's, by the way, 5 years. So in 2015, that sounded like it's way off. It's like 15 years away. Well, it's 5 years away now. And we have to get down by 2050 about 84% down. And then we have to go below zero by 2070. And we have to have ways to capture carbon, which, of course, the fossil fuel company wants money from the IRA for CCS, all right, to be able to capture some of their carbon, which in our chapter, we're dead set against, by the way. But wait a minute, what if we compromise? What if we do what politicians want to do? Let's only cut 21%, and then 64%. Well, this is a 2.0 consistent plan. We're already at 1.3, by the way. We're just almost at 1.5 now. And we have a 50% chance at 2C as it is. And then the optimistic 2.1, or the pledges and targets that we've gotten around the world, 2.6 degrees, or the current policies that could bring us as high as 3.1. So what are the scientists saying? So out of 780, I think it was climate scientists in the IPCC, 380 answered a Guardian questionnaire. Where are we going to end up by the end of the century? So when we look at it, every little red square is a scientist answer. So you can see there's a few scientists, 6 of them, who said, you know, we're going to be able to get to, you know, maybe even just slightly below 1.5 C. 16 said 1.5, 68, 2, 132, 2.5, 100, 3, and you can see it. Basically, what this says is 77% of the climate scientists believe we'll hit at least 2.5 C, and then more climate scientists feel that we're going to hit 3C or above than contain to 2.C. So that's where we stand. Let's believe the scientists and not negotiate the science. There's a budget. It's just like our home budget. It's a business budget. It's hard to negotiate the science. All right. With that said, you can see that the annual average of surface temperature of the Earth is in the black line that you see here. And with 20-year smoothing, you can see that we're up to about 1.3 C right now. Yet the natural drivers, some people like to say, and this is one of the disinformation things. Oh, you know, it's the orbit of the Earth. It's natural events. Well, you can see the natural events right here. They have an insignificant impact on anything. In fact, right now we should be in a cooling phase, and we're not. On the right, you can see what's happening to the oceans. And we know with Helene and Milton, what has happened to, you know, South Carolina and Georgia and in Florida, just absolutely devastating, right? And we can see from 1880 to about 1940, the cold water, the average is in the center there, zero C. And you can see how around 1940, things started to pop up and down. Hey, we started to get some real variance here. But by 1975, look what happened. All right. And when that happens, we start to have lots of hurricanes. So when DeSantis, the governor of Florida, says, we've always had bad hurricanes, it's just something, there's no more than usual. He's absolutely wrong about this. I don't know where he's getting it, but if you listen to Michael Mann and other people, it's very clear that we're having more intense storms and we're having more of them. In fact, let's look at that. Pre-climate crisis versus now, how many storms per century? I mean, 1 in 100-year storms. With 2 degrees C, 20 of them. And then if we go to 1 in 20-year storms, what would it look like? You can see what's happening here. The pre-climate crisis now, and then 2 degrees C. Now, what about water? What about precipitation, right? You can see we're going underwater here, right? If we look at the Southeast, 37% increase in precipitation in areas that have so much lowlands that if the ocean comes in and the rain hits them, we all know what happened in Florida. But, you know, it's everywhere. The Northeast, 45% up in the Midwest where Bruce and I live. 21%. The only place it's not is where they already had rain, and that would be Seattle and so forth. They always had a lot of rain, but minor impact to them. So when we look at these massive wildfires, this is the same type of thing. If we go to the 2010s up to 2020, this is what it kind of looks like. And then we hit the 2020s, you can see how many more millions of acres per year. So it isn't just the number of fires, it's how big they are. And finally, kind of wrap this up, I'll mention the wilderness areas. Yeah. So if we look at David Attenborough, one of his movies, I took this from his movie. In 1937, we had 2.3 billion people on the planet. Atmospheric CO2 is a nice 280 parts per million. Remaining wilderness, 67%. By the time we get to 2020, we get 7.8 billion people, 415 parts per million, and 35% remaining wilderness, which of course is the lungs of the planet, right? And then in 2024, 8.1 billion, 422 ppm or more. I mentioned 425, 427. And the estimates range between 19 and 23 to 25% of wilderness left. Very serious problem. So, you know, I know Al Gore in his presentations goes for hundreds of slides of devastating, you know, slides of beautiful pictures of horrible events. I'll just leave it to this one here, which is bad enough, and which is estimated that the global housing market, according to The Economist, is going to be $25 trillion by 2050. That's part of the damages in that previous slide that I showed you. So let's get into what we can do. I think we'll launch it. Bruce Mainzer is co-chair of the Climate Reality Project Chicago. We share a lead in the electric vehicle group. And Bruce has been a member of the regional, he worked for the Regional Transit Authority. He's an authority in marketing in various areas such as knowledge about Pace Bus and the Chicago Transit Authority, et cetera. So Bruce, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. So we are all seeing disinformation increase this year as fossil fuel interests ramp up their disinfo on social media. And while politicians are not really talking about the climate crisis right now, it's leaving a void that these disinfo agents can fill in. Next slide. So even when it's important that in our activities, we not further the disinfo. And these are recommendations that I found on the European Union site. The European Union has a very good section, if you ever go there, on their climate page on how to counter disinfo. And so I think these are very good. So I'm just going to read it. One is when you see disinfo, and I'm sure you've seen it on Facebook or on social media or even in your newspapers. We have a very conservative newspaper here in Chicago called the Chicago Tribune. You need to report disinfo when you see it. And you can do that on social media platforms. The second thing is, and I'm guilty of doing this, do not engage with the poster, the person who makes the post. This will only amplify his message and give it more attention. You need to find a way to remove discussion on it and help to spread correct information through your channels and networks, online and offline. Don't be shy. You know, you can talk about solutions or what you've come across. And be aware, of course, of your own biases and get your information from diverse sources for a balanced perspective, except for the Chicago Tribune. Next slide. Oh. Yeah, there it is. Thank you. So there was an article I saw in The Guardian, which is a very fine paper from last April, which I think very well captures the messaging strategies right now of the fossil fuel industry. And so it's centered around these points. So I'll just spend a little time talking about each of these points that the fossil fuel industry uses to combat or to lay down disinformation. One is energy security, and I'm sure you've heard this. The fossil fuel industry loves to trumpet its role in keeping the world safe, even when it is engaging in pursuing more drilling and more fossil fuel burning, which makes us less secure. The fact is, the US military lists climate change and continuing to burn fossil fuel as a major threat to world peace. Next is you hear the economy versus the environment. And Tom mentioned this about, you know, it's too expensive to do this, as some oil executives say. The fossil fuel industry has hammered this theme repeatedly for decades, that taking care of the environment is bad for the economy, saying that it would just be way too expensive to act on climate, and that in any case, Climate change was not going to be a big deal, so the best thing to do is to do nothing. The next one is we make your life work. The fossil fuel industry loves to argue that it makes the world work, from keeping the lights on to keeping us riveted by smartphones, TV, and clothed in the fast fashion. It's genius. Create a product, create demand for the product, and then shift the blame to consumers, not just for buying, but also for the associated impacts. And Tom spent a lot of time on this part of their strategy. Next one is called We're Part of the Solution. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of advertising that the oil companies are actively working on a solution, when in reality, they're spending just a pittance on real solutions and continuing to drill and expand their fossil fuel capacities. One of the most infamous companies is BP. You know, they changed their logo to be green and whatever. And I think I read somewhere that they spend less than 1.5% on green solutions. But we see it in their advertising. We also see it in the industry's embrace of the term low carbon to describe not only fossil fuel enabling solutions like carbon capture, but also natural gas, which industry lobbyists are successfully selling to politicians as a climate solution or a bridge to a zero emission future. And it's hardly the case. As we mentioned, natural gas, which is methane gas, is actually 80 times more heat capturing than regular carbon dioxide. And then finally, the world's greatest neighbor, just in case people still aren't accepting dirty air, dirty water, and climate change, the fossil fuel industry funds museums, sports, aquariums, and schools, serving the dual purpose of cleaning up its image. But here in Chicago, we launched an initiative with other climate environmental groups to get the city of Chicago to file a lawsuit against oil companies. And that lawsuit has been filed by the city of Chicago. So we are actively in the fight to hold these companies accountable. Next slide, please. So if we are going to address how to attack the emissions problem, we all need to understand the big picture. And this gives us the picture. This is a pie chart of where emissions are coming from in the US. And the largest source of emissions is transportation. So these are largely emissions produced by each of us as individuals driving our passenger cars and light duty trucks. So if you look at that blue slice, which is 28% of emissions, close to 60% of that sector, of that blue slice, is our personal cars and our personal light duty trucks, not industry, not the military. It's our personal cars. So that's a lot. Similarly, if you look at the electricity slice, the orange slice, which is 25% of all, 70% of that slice is also due to us as individuals, as 70% of electric power is consumed by households. And finally, if you look at the residential commercial slice of 13%, half of those emissions are directly coming from buildings we live in, you know, either apartment buildings or homes. And it's primarily coming from oil and natural gas furnaces to heat our homes. So go to the next slide. So based on the household usage of these three slices, transportation, residences, and electrical power, if you sum up those personal sectors within those sectors, you will come up to with the calculation that 40% of all greenhouse gases come from households. And it's potentially, we can eliminate that if we all make the right choices. So we really like this company. I'm sure you know of them, Rewiring America. They've been very helpful in creating understanding about the Inflation Reduction Act. And their CEO made this statement, and I think it's so important, I'm going to read it. Around 42% of the United States carbon emissions come from our homes and the vehicles we drive. simply switching everything in our lives to be powered by electricity from renewable energy will go a long way toward getting our emissions down and reducing the impact of climate change. Rewiring America estimates that to achieve zero emissions, we need to install 1 billion new machines. So machines being EVs, gas furnaces, etc., or 50 million machines a year for the next 20 to 25 years. It's a lot, but it's very doable if everyone stops buying fossil fuel machines. As a bonus, you'll also get better performance and lower utility bills from your new electric appliances. Now, as we discuss what we need to change in our houses, be aware that we at the Chicago Climate Reality Project, we're not telling anyone to go out and buy a new appliance now, even though I love my car that's behind me. Instead, we should all be aware of the fossil fuel machines, cars, gas furnaces, stoves, hot water heater, gas range, and stovetop that are operating now in the household. It's important that once these appliances or cars reach the end of their useful life, whether that will be in a couple of years or let's say 10 to 12 years because you just recently bought a new gas furnace, for example, it's critical that you be ready to replace that machine with a machine that does not burn fossil fuel and continue to contribute to the climate crisis. Because when you replace your car or your gas furnace with another gasoline-powered car or newer gas furnace, you are committing to and really taking the opposite of an electrification pledge, because you are pledging another 8 or 12 years of burning fossil fuels as long as that apparatus is operating. And that is a huge problem for the planet. And it also commits you, in very many cases, to continue to pay higher utility costs or expensive gasoline to power your car for another substantial period of time. Next slide, please. So during this period where politicians are not talking about solutions to the climate crisis and mainstream news and social media repeat the myths that are being spread that climate solutions do not exist now, or we're not ready for EVs or heat pumps, or we have time to solve the climate crisis, we at the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project are doubling down on the pledge that we have prepared to have the general public commit to replacing all their fossil fuel machines with electric machines. So we simply put this out: as my home appliances and vehicles reach the end of their useful life, I pledge to be ready to replace them with electric alternatives and encourage my friends, family, and community to do the same. Next slide. So we put this pledge on our website, and the Chicago chapter has made the pledge front and center of our website. We have, once you take the pledge, or even if you don't take the pledge, there's helpful links to the Rewiring America site, and also a list of recommendations on how to find vendors or installation people to install some of these things when we give advice on electric vehicles. So it's been very important for us, and it remains a major focus of our efforts. Next slide, please. So, of course, in this meeting, we're talking to an audience in Dallas-Fort Worth who are activists like us in Chicago, who have been pressuring organizations to step up and meet today's climate challenge. These activities remain very important to us, so we have a second part of the pledge to guide us in our actions. So this is more for the internal climate reality community. We continue to push through this period of disinformation and skepticism about climate solutions. So we need more people to write more, talk more, be more visible, get on radio stations and in newspapers to extend our message. Both Tom and I have gotten op-eds in the major papers here, and we influence a lot of things, and it's just a matter of just doing it. You find that the newspapers and radio stations are often looking for information from people like us. So we just put this at the end. I will encourage my municipal elected officials and staff to provide information on federal, state, and local incentives on their website and at community events. I will support informing businesses, institutions, churches, synagogues, and libraries on the benefits and incentives for electrification. Next slide, please. So a big resource, as I mentioned, is the Rewiring America organization, and that they have a very helpful guidebook that you can download called Electrify Everything, and it's really a great map as to how you can start on your journey to electrify everything in your home and get rid of your fossil fuel machines. Next slide. So as an example of why we think this is so important, these savings in greenhouse gases that can be produced by electrifying your apparatuses or your appliances are really significant. So for example, rooftop solar panels, before change, 4 to 5 metric tons of greenhouse gases a year, you can get that down to almost 0, so a reduction of 4. Electric vehicles, don't listen to people who say, oh, electric vehicles don't make a difference. They make a huge difference. You can save, depending on the car, you can save 2 to 3 metric tons of greenhouse gases. That's a lot. And if you have more than one car, just think about those savings. And then a really big one is converting your furnace, although it might be less in Dallas because the temperatures during the winter aren't as strong. But here in the Midwest, this is a huge source of greenhouse gases to have a fossil fuel furnace. And then electric water heater can save about a metric ton approximately, so instead of using a gas water heater, which is very common. So if you look overall, you can save about 7 metric tons with just one car, and bring your house down. This is very conservative because if you have a large, this is only for I think a 2,000 square foot home. So it can be very significant. Next slide, B. So one of the things that is going on is that there's part of the disinfo that's happening is people are talking about Teslas and how expensive electric vehicles are, and they're really not up to date as to the total cost of operation and the fact that EV prices are going down. So I did a little analysis of this last year, and the point was, the federal and tax credit of $7,500 is changing all the time. Sometimes a model has it, sometimes it doesn't. But I try to encourage people, just look at what these cars cost and compare it to a gasoline car, and then look at your total cost of operation. So look over 5 years. So yeah, obviously right now the Volkswagen ID4, which is a much nicer car than the Nissan Rogue, there's no argument that with the federal tax credit, it's a much better deal. It's a lower price. And then if you look at the 5-year costs, the fuel costs are less than half of the over 5 years of what you pay in a gasoline car. And by the way, Tom and I charge our cars almost 95% at home. We only take 1 or 2 road trips a year, so we're not using public chargers. These costs are based on a mix of public and private charging. But in essence, if you're private charging, you're saving twice as much as that. Your fuel costs will be 25% of fuel. So that's even a greater savings. And then these other costs for insurance, maintenance, repairs, these are higher numbers than I've really experienced, especially when it comes to maintenance and repairs. I've owned 2 EVs over the last 4 years, and I think Tom's owned 3, and none of us have ever spent a dime on repairs or maintenance. The only maintenance is tires and the windshield wipers, and that's it. So these are conservative numbers, and there's no argument that with the deal, 7,500, it's a better deal. But even if you get a Kia Niro electric, which is a little more, it's still about the same price without the $7,500 federal tax credit. Now, I developed this page about 3 or 4 months ago, and then Tom told me that suddenly the Kia Niro electric now qualifies for the 7,500. So it's changing all the time, but there are some great deals out there. Next slide.
And if I could just add something,
sure.
if you charge on, let's say you have rooftop solar, it's even cheaper. I mean,
Right.
it causes emissions to go near zero.
Right. It's cost to zero and emissions to zero. So, oh, so on this slide, because we're seeing so much disinfo that Americans aren't ready for EVs, it's important to debunk the current myths that we are seeing in mainstream media and from auto manufacturers that hybrids are a good bridge solution and EVs are really for the future. This is totally untrue. When you buy a hybrid, you are going to pay a higher cost for your vehicle because you are paying for two different propulsion systems, the gasoline-powered internal combustion engine and the battery to power the car when it has enough juice. Furthermore, we don't consider hybrids an adequate solution to reduce greenhouse gases because if you're going to keep that hybrid for 10 to 12 years, you're going to allow it to continue to contribute to the climate crisis. So if you look at the orange slice, the gasoline emissions, even if you have a hybrid, those gasoline emissions are never going to go away. But if you look at the electric, or especially that column, the grid is constantly improving. When I started at Climate Reality, the grid serving Chicago was about 75% fossil fuel. It's now 62% fossil fuel because a lot of renewable energy like wind and solar have come online. So the grid's going to get better and better. So if you buy a battery electric vehicle, even if you don't have solar, over time that car will perform better and better as the grid improves. And so you're not going to get that. And plus, in my opinion, hybrids and plug-in hybrids aren't really saving as much greenhouse gases as we need to in this current crisis. So to wrap up here, I also found that there are a lot of tips for addressing climate disinformation, and we just touched on a few of them. But whenever I'm seeing in the political campaign right now that people are starting to politicians are being a lot more honest about calling it as it is, especially this fellow Tim Walz, who called the other candidate the F word. I meant the F word that the second letter is an A. So I think it's the same thing with disinfo. Don't be afraid to use the D word when it fits. Notice the subtle threats, not just the obvious ones, and recognize who is behind the climate disinformation. Remember their motivations, and make sure you know their tactics. And there's a word here that has been introduced that I really like a lot, and that is pre-bunking. I used the word debunking in the previous slide, but really what we need to do is pre-bunk. This means get out ahead of the disinformation, get the information out so that you advocate for systemic change. That puts the climate disinfo audience on their heels. Right now, when you react to their disinfo and you try to counter it, we're back on our heels. Next slide. So other people call it inoculate. And this quote from this journalist Kalpana Jain is really good. People producing misinformation have shifted tactics, moving from the old denial of climate solutions to the new denial of questioning climate solutions. So this is where the whole thing comes with, especially with EVs lately. You had the GM and Ford a couple of years ago saying they're going to be all EVs, and then they blew the introduction of it's their fault that the market hasn't taken to EVs as quickly as other countries, because they tried to mimic Tesla with high price points. That market was already saturated, and they found they had too high priced EVs to generate the substantial demand that they needed. But like Tom mentioned, they blame the consumer when it was really their fault. So we need to really push through this and create information that shows people, like we just showed here, that these solutions work and we're ready for them now. Yeah, so these are some of the things I talked about. 59% think EVs are too expensive. Range anxiety. I can't believe the number of people I know that are worried about range anxiety, and yet they travel only 25 to 50 miles a day, and they're only thinking about the one trip a year that they make. And you know, it's illogical that you would buy into the higher costs of a gasoline car just for that one trip a year. The fires, the electric bills will go up with an EV. You know, there's just all this.
Yeah. If I could
Go
just
ahead.
insert also this issue of the battery's going to go bad, right? But batteries have a federal law. There's a federal law that says they have an 8-year, 100,000-mile warranty. Now, most people keep their cars for 8 years. So for that entire 8 years, it will be under warranty for that battery. So the fear people have, I mean, lease it if you're concerned, or if you buy it, you know, sell it in 8 years before the battery goes out of warranty. But the history shows, I mean, there's lots of evidence that we could provide, shows that these things will last as long as the car, right, Bruce?
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, it's like I don't keep cars that long anyway because I like to lease my cars. But you know, it's a phony issue, and yet you see it all the time on social media. All right, next slide. So I like to end with this slide, and you know, we see a lot of complex arguments. You know, natural gas is a bridge fuel, and we have a solution here, but it's going to take us time. How many have heard that? And I like to just keep this simple thought in my head. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. There is renewable energy out there, and in every case, we need to think about stopping burning of fossil fuels. And if the solution involves burning fossil fuels, it's not a solution. So next slide, and I think we're ready to go. Oh, yeah, we're ready to go into any questions or however you want to take it, Beth.
Yes, excellent. We will move into our Q&A. If you can't, there we go. There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent, excellent presentation. All right, lots to digest. Who's got a question? Yes, go for it, Maureen.
I'm actually living in California at the moment, so the conditions are slightly different than Texas, where I was before. What I read is that Texas produces more energy from regenerative sources than all the other states put together, but I don't see how that plays into how Texas is perceived or what's being done in Texas. Can you sort that out for me, please?
Well, I mean, I just comment by saying the fact that they produce so much wind and solar power, it's very impressive. Only California produces more. The problem is they're not getting rid of the other.
Ah,
Yeah, they're still burning a lot of natural gas, etc. Michael, go ahead.
Oh, you're muted, Michael.
One of the largest investors in Texas in the solar is Florida Power. Florida Power put on an amendment to the Constitution, which failed, by the way, to outlaw solar power for private individuals. They have a lock on the state of Florida, so they take their profits from the state of Florida and invest them in solar power in Texas, which is not competitive. So there's no honor among thieves here. They're just basically using their monopoly in Florida to fund a new emerging power source, which is valuable in Texas, but it doesn't show that anybody in Texas is doing anything moral. I wanted to add the question that, or the statement, that over the last 10 years, the fossil fuel industry has spent $1 trillion in campaign contributions in the United States. When I went to Harvard Business School, I was taught it's cheaper often to buy a politician than it is to pay for regulation. That's a flat statement I heard coming out of faculty at Harvard. They are spending $50 billion a year on campaign contributions. So as soon as the city of Tampa passed a city ordinance after, if you remember the spill they had of phosphates from the chemical fertilizer industry that creates the red tide along the coast of Florida. If y'all recall this 3 or 4 years ago, it was Tampa passed that law, and within 1 week, Florida Power had paid $50,000 a piece to the legislators on the Energy Committee to pass a law to say the cities could not regulate energy in any way at all. The final thing I will add to you is that there have just been 4 felony charges placed in Florida against a political operative who was paid for by Florida Power and Light. That's different from Florida Power. The political operative had put up 3 candidates who were, quote, ghost candidates, could not possibly be elected, but by running, they drew off enough votes from legitimate candidates to give a supermajority in Florida. That is what's enabled DeSantis to do the insanity he's done. And if you don't notice, I'm sitting in Orlando, and around me, driving down the streets, you see the debris from the hurricanes. And DeSantis, the week before the hurricane, signed a bill to eliminate the words climate crisis from any legislation.
Yeah.
So I will close by saying there is a group starting to work on political action coming out of the UN because the COP process has totally failed over a 30-year period to deliver us control over fossil fuels. I personally believe, and I believe a lot of people would agree with me, that this is not something that we can vote a solution to because there's a lock on our legislatures that keeps our vote from counting. As a result, we have to be in the streets. We have to be marching and agitating globally, not just the US, but globally, to be able to get the change in the regulation. So sorry for that long-winded answer.
No, that's really good. And, we need some kind of, campaign contribution laws back in process like we used to have.
We've got to reform our Congress, which is totally,
We do.
No longer responds to our votes.
Yep.
Chip? Thank you, Michael. Oh, you're muted, Chip.
All right, let's try that again. Sorry, I've also had some internet problems. So I got if my question's been answered, just tell me. But I wanted to thank you again for the presentation. I've had the privilege of hearing it before and seeing its evolution. And my question relates to the challenging time we're in, and it kind of builds on Mickey Lynn's point there about the political obstacles. But part of the reason we have trouble doing that right now is because we view it only in the information deficit model. And I would urge you to consider taking on the values piece. For example, in the political campaign right now, that's what's happening with the reclaiming of patriotism, Chance at USA at the rallies, and reference to economic opportunity and national security and so forth that we see, so that's not just a one-sided issue. This used to also not be a one-sided partisan issue. So the values piece would speak to people's values and not just information or rationality, because there is an irrational aspect of this. And if you can connect at the emotive level about people's desire to provide for their families and preserve the beauty of their surrounding natural environment and so forth, that has resonance and has proven in the extensive scholarship to be very powerful. So it's not just information or misinformation. Another piece of feedback, if you don't mind, I'll give is that this can have complexity. I just finished a year-long Amnesty International report with a global group that talks about how EVs have complex supply chains that have social and environmental sustainability costs, including human rights costs. If the critical minerals in particular, and I'll email this to you guys, it just came out, if the critical minerals are mined with child labor or child soldiers or artisanal labor that's not got labor rights protections in the Congo and so forth. And none of the companies are doing great on this, but believe it or not, Tesla's doing relatively well compared to, say, obviously the Chinese companies. So that's another thing, is that these issues can be complex, and the repetition of your final point in fossil fuels is critical, and repeating the point that we need to make sure the EVs, for example, are powered by renewable energy. Otherwise, we don't achieve the goals. That repetition, that needs to be repeated several times.
Yeah, Chip, if I could make a few comments on that.
Yeah, just the final point, my
I'm
question
sorry.
before you do it, Tom, is just that, right now we're in an all of the above energy strategy on both sides, really. So that's my real question is, do you think it's really possible to do that? Or can we even sustain the idea of, say, the World Bank continuing to fund fossil fuel projects? Climate Reality had a seminar on that today and says no. So that's my real question, but please go ahead and make your comments and response.
So I did want to comment on the minerals that you're talking about for EVs. There's no question about it, and that's why the IRA requires minerals from responsibly sourced, or you don't get the tax credit. Okay, so many EVs don't get a tax credit. First of all, they have to be made the EV has to be made in North America. Second of all, half of the remaining part of the $7,500, it has to be the minerals in the battery have to be responsibly sourced, and they have to come from responsible countries and so forth and so on. It's not perfect, but neither are catalytic converters that have palladium and platinum that come from Norilsk, Russia, that nobody seems to complain about. So EVs are not perfect. The fact is, if you take a typical Tesla or any other modern EV and you look at the emissions to make that battery, it is 1 year or less these days. So in other words, the EV pays for that battery in about a year. So the other 12 years or 11 years that car will be on the road, it's paid for those battery emissions. So it's not perfect. And it's getting better every day. For example, they're going to what's called LFP batteries right now, which are much more responsible in terms of nickel and cadmium, nickel and some of these other minerals that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that as EVs become more of a greater proportion, more of batteries will be obtained through recycling of existing batteries. So a lot of times these arguments about the difficulty of finding lithium or other rare metals over time go away, because a high proportion of future batteries will be made by recycling of the older batteries.
For example, Redwood Materials is a gigantic organization that recycles, old Nissan Leaf batteries and so forth. And most of the companies want to do that, because if they get it from responsible sources, then there's more likely they'll qualify for the $7,500 tax credit. But I did want to respond to some of the other points you made, Chip. Bruce and I do other types of presentations. For example, we do them on electric vehicles alone. It covers a lot more information, much more on the what's in it for me for the EV, which we didn't have time for tonight. The other thing that Bruce and I do is for example, I do one called how to save money and how to save the planet, because both of those are the what's in it for me. A lot of people don't care about emissions. They really don't. They care about their family's budget. So we have to appeal to that first and show. Bruce did like one slide on that tonight. I mean, we have more on this, okay, that we cover in a lot more detail. But it's important to go for that and then kind of have the climate part, especially in more red states and so forth. The climate stuff is almost like icing on the cake, So
Good point.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm looking at the clock and it is time for us to wrap up. Bruce and Tom, thank you again. Very informative, very thorough. Yes.
thanks.
Really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for joining us and
Okay.
sharing. See, you're getting lots of clapping hands. Good job.
Thank
Well
you guys
done.
for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll be having one more meeting in the year, our November meeting. And we're going to have Rose Jones and our very own Alex Holland joining us. Alex was our co-chair a couple of years ago. And the theme is the intersection of heat and health and workers' safety. And there's a petition coming up. We'll have information about it in our next newsletter, and they will talk about it. It's a Dallas petition, and I think the window for signing it lasts until through the first week of December. So, and they will also be addressing the issue of heat in vulnerable population. So that said, I want to thank us all for our love of the earth and each other, and for our passion and our activism, each of us doing our part collectively and individually, both matter. And our closing philosophy will be thinking again about the season. And it's harvest. We are harvesting what we have grown. We have the opportunity to take a look at what we have grown as chapters, as individuals, in our own lives, to be grateful to the earth for her bounty, as well as being grateful for ourselves and the bounty that we are reaping by our actions, how we live our lives, and by our activism.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all. If anybody, we're officially closed, but if anybody wants to stay on for a couple of more moments, or chatting or asking Bruce and Tom a couple more questions, please feel free to do that. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.